So thank you very much for coming this evening. I know some of you have had very difficult journeys with the floods and the transport. You may be wondering why I've put up this video of a 1959 Chevy crashing into a 2009 Chevy. And actually, what the video shows you is so obvious, you probably haven't noticed it, and that is cars have improved enormously over 50 years. The car from 1959 is pretty much a complete wreck here, and you've probably noticed the driver is almost completely destroyed, whereas the driver of the 2009 car, the passenger compartment isn't even collapsed. The windscreen on the car isn't broken. He would walk out from that with no broken legs or anything. Cars have improved enormously. And yet, 50 or so years ago, we thought cars like this Edsel were the most beautiful thing that ever happened. And I'm sure today you can just look at that car and see that it looks dangerous. If you hit the front of it, it's like a bulldozer and it's got sharp edges. It is not designed to be safe. And yet people 50 years ago loved these things. It changed when Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, and pretty much he exposed the automobile industry for selling exciting cars rather than safe cars. So, I'm Harold Thimbleby, and I'm going to give you a lecture on designing IT to make healthcare safer. And I'm going to start with cars, and I'm going to finish with cars. So, you can see here I've been run over. And obviously this is a mocked-up accident in the States. In 2012, there were about 2,000 road deaths in Britain, which is the lowest since records began in 1926. That picture of me being run over is very photogenic, and we want to do something about road safety. We're worried about seat belts, airbags, better tyres, you name it. We want to make cars safer. It's obvious that this is what we want to do. 2,000 people die on the roads, and we want to make them safer. The latest estimates in the Journal of Patient Safety is, in fact, this is an American study, and I have multiplied by the British population and divided by the American population. So this is scaling it, just taking Britain as being similar to the United States. 88,000 preventable hospital deaths occur every year in Britain, or 400,000 in the United States. A preventable death is one that should not have happened. Something has gone wrong with the management of the patient. For instance, you take out the right kidney instead of the left kidney and then the patient dies from that. That should not happen. That is a preventable death. Put it another way, perhaps in a humorous way, you're 50 times safer on the road than in a hospital bed, which perhaps means you're better off in an ambulance than in the hospital bed. But joking aside, these figures are shocking when they're looked at like this. Heart disease is our biggest killer, 26%. Cancer is next, 23%. And then preventable hospital error is 18%. And it's underreported. If you go into hospital because of cancer and then you die because of an error, almost certainly that's not going to be recorded as an error. You died of cancer. And of course, if you die from anything in hospital, you're probably dying from the disease that put you there. Nobody's going to come up to you and say, I'm very sorry your husband died because I made a mistake. They're going to say, we're very sorry your husband died because they got an infection. They're very ill and they got an infection and the infection killed us. The subtext is perhaps the infection was preventable. So if bad design, the environment that leads to this bad management in hospitals, if bad design was a disease, it would be about our third biggest killer. So, let's have a look at healthcare. We've got preventable error, perhaps our third biggest killer. We've got an aging population. Things are going to get worse. We've got chronic diseases like diabetes and obesity and Alzheimer's and the rest of it. And we've got everybody expecting more from the NHS. And the NHS, of course, has got a reducing budget. You can argue with each of these details. You can argue with these incredible figures of preventable deaths. The bottom line is healthcare is in crisis. And it would seem that computer systems would be the solution to many of these problems. Right? Computers are everywhere in healthcare. They're in gadgets, they're in patient record systems, they control the Wi-Fi and everything else. Computers are the future. So computers are going to help make the NHS better. But it's not as easy as that, and there's a lot of confused thinking. One of my favourite quotes is from David Bates. I don't think he meant to say this, really, if he thought about it. But anyway, in a paper with 13 authors, Journal of American Medical Association, he wrote, "Computerized approaches are ideal for eliminating error because reliability can approach 100%. Right? Which sounds good. Let's have more computers because they will eliminate error. But there's a confusion there. I've got a hammer and it's 100% reliable, but it doesn't stop it hurting me. I can still hit myself with it. There's a big difference between reliability, the computer doing what it was programmed to do, and the computer doing the right thing and being safe in the hospital environment. Here are some photographs I've taken in hospital environments. On the end of every arrow is a computer of one sort or another. And for all I know, some of the people have got implants with little computers in them as well. Is this working? Well, there's a controversial paper that appeared in Pediatrics in 2005. The hospital installed a computer system and the paediatric ward kept track of their mortality before and after the computer system was installed. And here's a figure I've stolen from the paper. So the green line shows you the average. About 3% of their patients were dying a year. So quarter 4, 2001, quarter 1, 2002, quarter 2, 2002, quarter 3, 2002. It goes up and down, but in about 3%. And then they install an off-the-shelf, as it's called, computer system used all over the United States. And this is what happened. The mortality doubles. Right? Why? Well, there are lots of reasons, apart from it being a bad computer system. The simplest was, if you've got a computer system, somebody has to use it. So effectively, every patient has lost a nurse or a physician to play with a keyboard. And the computer has to be better than the loss in staff time. And it wasn't. It was worse, because when one person was playing with the computer, the blood bank would be locked out of it, so they couldn't get the right blood for the patient until that physician logged off, and so on, and the pharmacy couldn't use it. There were all sorts of funny things going on as well, but basically, the computer wasn't an automatic improvement to the hospital ward. Here's a picture of an iPad being used in surgery. I'm going to call this the Homer reflex, and you'll find out why I call it Homer in a minute. But when you look at something like an iPad, you think, wow, it's wonderful, I want to have one. In fact, I want to have an iPad mini, or an iPad 2 or a Retina screen. Apple have figured out how to make us drool over technology. And it's then very easy to get so excited by it, you have to have it. And to confuse the excitement as us as consumers wanting to buy, for instance, Apple or Samsung or whatever manufacturer it is, they know how to make us want it, which is very different from knowing how to make stuff that is good and appropriate to use in a hospital. For instance, you can see this iPad is wrapped up in an X-ray bag to stop blood fluids getting on it and making a mess of things. So, when we look more closely at this technology, what does it look like? Here are some photographs I took. I went to the Massachusetts General Hospital a couple of weeks ago and had a look at their infusion pumps. They're all completely different. There are hundreds of them in one hospital. The Institute of Self-Medication Practices says intravenous pump keypad design causes confusion. I've made some notes on what keypad design looks like, and here are some of the keypads on infusion pumps. What can you say about it? They're random. The manufacturers show no evidence of caring about the design of keypads, and yet the Institute of Self-Medication Practices, the design of keypads is crucial. If you get used to the infusion pump on the top left, an Abbott Themstar, and then move on to use the Abbott AIM Plus, you're going to make a mess of things. Here's a more startling way of representing this. These are both Bodyguard 545s. And they are completely different. Let me just walk over here. So here, you've got an increase button, which is number 2, and a decrease button, which is number 0. And here, the increase is 5, and the decrease is 0. You're supposed to use a capital L for litres, so that it's not confused with ones. So up there, you've got a lowercase l for litres. And that's just taking a couple of seconds to point out the differences between these things. It's the same device. This is going to cause a mess for nurses, for trainers. As you get used to one, swap it over to the other, and it's different. You're going to make what are called transfer errors. I'm going to call this again the Homer reflex, because the one on the right, the manufacturers think is a colour, high-resolution display, so it must be better. This is a photograph I took in the Massachusetts General Hospital last week, and I'll walk over again. So here it says 9 millilitres per hour, and here it's saying milligrams per hour, and this is module A. Okay. And if you look at module A from a different angle, it's module 9. And from a different angle, it's module H. And from another angle, it's module 4. Right? It wasn't designed to be readable. Frankly, I think it was designed to save money. And I was playing with it, and the technical term is I was reverse engineering it, and I got this wonderful piece of text on it. It then crashed, and I couldn't use it. I'll make it a bit bigger. Minus 0.1 is less than the minimum rate. Right? And you can't suck stuff out of people with an infusion pump. Right? It's a bug. Here is a Baxter colleague, which I played with last year. And this is a rather bad photograph I took of it, so I'm going to enlarge part of that screen and show you how it works. So there's part of the screen of the Baxter colleague, and I'm going to enter 1.5, and you'll see 1.5 appear on the screen just here. Right? It's not difficult. I'm going to press 1.5, and this is how it works, 1.5. Yep. I'll clear it, and I'm now going to enter 100.5. Here we go, 100.5. The infusion pump has thrown away the decimal point without warning anybody. And so you've got a number entered that is 10 times larger. And unless the nurse is incredibly attentive, they're not going to notice. Nurses are busy. You know, they've got lots of things going on in the ward, not just the patient they're dealing with. Are they going to notice this little thing? The device beeps when you enter the decimal point, as if it has been handled, and yet it's ignoring it, ending up with a dose that's 10 times too high. It does matter. Here is an infusion pump, which I've got here. This is the sort of thing. Denise Melanson was a throat cancer victim, and she was on Fluorouracil. She was what's called an ambulatory patient. She was walking around with this infusion pump with a bag, about a litre of Fluorouracil, and the bag runs out of Fluorouracil. She goes back to the Alberta Cancer Care Centre for her bag to be refilled and for the infusion pump to be reprogrammed. And 2 nurses did this, and unfortunately they both agreed on giving her an overdose. Obviously, they didn't think of it like that. They forgot to divide by 24 hours a day, so they programmed this infusion pump to deliver 28.8 mils per hour instead of 1.2 mils per hour. So 4 hours later, Denise Melanson goes back to the Alberta Cancer Care Centre and says, my bag is empty. And she should have gone back 4 days later. There isn't any antidote for an overdose of Fluorouracil. So sadly, she died from multiple organ failure. And the Institute of Self-Medication Practices did a root cause analysis, which is freely available, because they want to avoid this sort of problem happening again, which is fantastic. Let's have a look at the infusion pump. I've enlarged it here. And there are so many things wrong with this. Let's pick out 2 of them. Here's the decimal point, which is on an up arrow key. So this is confusing. It does 2 different things. At the top, you can see there are 3 options. If you press 1, 2, 3, you can get those options. And milligrams per milliliter, micrograms per milliliter, and mils per hour. Right? Although it says mils, it's actually mils per hour. And if you press the help button, you get only help on milligrams per mil because there isn't space to provide the help for the rest of it. We could carry on criticising it, but the root cause analysis decided to do what's called a human factors study. They wanted to find out what went wrong when the nurses went through the procedure that ended up with overdosing Denise Melanson. So they got 2 hours and 6 nurses off the ward, familiar with the protocol, and they got them to go through what had ended up giving Denise Melanson an overdose. And this is what they found. 100% of the nurses were confused by the setup or selection of mils per hour. And you can see that's not surprising because the device shows mils, not mils per hour. 100% pressed start incorrectly, 40% were confused by the user interface, 60% needed help to use it, and 60% were confused by the decimal point. That was something I showed you earlier because the decimal point and the up arrow are muddled. In a way, none of this matters. The bottom line matters, and the bottom line is 60% of the nurses entered incorrect data and said, "I've finished." Part of the problem was not just the infusion pump, but was the drug bag. And this is the drug bag that I've got out of the root cause analysis, and bits of it have been blacked out to maintain the anonymity of some of the people who are working there. This has got a lot of numbers on it. Imagine your job, you're a nurse, and your job is to work out how many mils per hour to give the patient. To make it easier, I've put all the numbers down here. There are about 20 numbers. In fact, you only need 3 of them. And in fact, why doesn't the drug bag say 1.2 mils per hour and be done with it? Because that is the rate that's required. Instead, I suspect the pharmacists who programmed this didn't want to be for blame if anything went wrong. Because if anything goes wrong, you can now blame the nurse who's cheaper than the pharmacist. Or maybe I'm being too cynical. Let's say you use a standard calculator to do the sum. The root cause analysis said the nurses used a calculator, and the root cause analysis doesn't say what calculator it was. I'm going to assume it was Casio's most popular calculator, and I've written a computer program. This is the fastest way I can do that sum on this calculator. That's 22 keystrokes. If you make a slip in one of those keystrokes, you'll end up with a different number. The whole point of using a calculator is to find an answer to a question you don't know. If you get the wrong answer, you don't know it's the wrong answer. And if 2 nurses make the same mistake, which is what happened with Denise Melanson, the calculator says, well, 28.8. I think it's astonishing that the manufacturers of the pharmacy label printing system and the manufacturers of the infusion pump didn't do any of the studies, which are now so completely obvious. Why didn't they spend 2 hours with 6 nurses to improve these devices and to find out what was wrong with them? They could have improved them and avoided the death, and possibly other deaths that aren't being reported. Calculators are much more interesting than you might have thought. One of my sons is getting married in China, and so you're vaguely interested in these things. China has got 1.3 billion people, and the world has got 6.8 billion. So what fraction of the world is Chinese, I wondered? So let's do it on this calculator. What you do is you clear it so that you don't have any mess from previous calculations, and you enter these numbers, and you press equals, and you get the answer 0.19. About 20% of the world is Chinese. A fifth of the world is Chinese. It's an incredible number of Chinese people, but this isn't surprising, right? The calculator's done the right thing. Let me take you through exactly the same question, but with the United States population, which is 307 million. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing, and the answer's 45% of the world is American. So, this is a sort of rhetorical question, but if I put it to you, what's happened? 2 zeros? No. Why did it work with the Chinese population? It's interesting, isn't it? With the Chinese population, there were 2 errors. The calculator's not big enough for the world population nor the Chinese population, and it silently threw away 2 zeros. I was doing a division, and so the 2 errors cancelled out. Here, the American population fits and the world population doesn't, and it's a factor of 10 out. But it doesn't tell you. It's willfully throwing away a digit without telling you it's making a mistake. Right? You use a calculator because you don't know what the answer is going to be. You'd expect the calculator to be designed to help detect errors, and here it doesn't bother. It's not just Casio calculators. They're all like this. Here's an Apple iPhone. If you do the same calculation with the American population this way, you get 45% of the world is American, which we know is scary, twice the size of China. If you do it this way, you get 4% of the world is American. So which answer's right? When I was at primary school, I was taught to do calculations in two different ways. And if I get different answers, then at least one of them, possibly both of them, are wrong. What this proves is inside the iPhone, there is some program code that can do the calculation in two different ways and get two different answers. And as it were, if they had been to primary school, they would know that at least one of these answers is wrong. And they can't be bothered to tell you. So calculators should not be used in hospitals because they are unsafe. They allow you to make slips that you may not notice, and they don't care. Let me tell you a story about Kimberly Hart. She was a pediatric nurse of 25 years standing in Seattle Children's Hospital, and one day she did a drug dose calculation and she made an error. She gave a poorly baby an overdose of calcium chloride. I don't know whether you've made errors, but one of the errors I often make is I lock myself out of my office. I've got a key card and I put it down on my desk and do stuff and then walk out of my room. The door goes click and I think, shit, I've locked myself out. And I've often wondered, how come I know at some level in me that I'm about to lock myself out, and as soon as the door clicks, shit. So I don't know what happened, but somehow Kimberly Hart knew she had given this baby an overdose. She made an error, and she noticed she had made an error after she had started the infusion, and you can't do anything about it. So she reported it. And this is what happened. She was escorted from the hospital, she was put on administrative leave, and then she was fired. And I'm afraid this is a story that gets worse and worse. The Nursing Commission gave her a $3,000 fine, and this is somebody who's been a paediatrician for 25 years, 80 hours of new coursework, and 4 years on probation. And it gets worse. She committed suicide. And the Seattle Times said the suicide of Kimberly Hart, a nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital, has opened wounds for friends and family members. It's horrible. And it gets worse. Because the Nursing Commission closed its investigation. I've written to them several times and they don't reply. But basically they're saying the nurse committed suicide, so it was the nurse's fault. That's the end of the story. It's basically a medieval witch hunt. And if the nurse drowns, it was their fault. We have no idea how she made the calculation error. She might have been using a Casio calculator, and it might have made a difference that the calculator messes up decimal points and too many digits. We have no idea. But it is an issue, isn't it? I bought a calculator recently. I couldn't resist it. This is Hewlett-Packard's EasyCalc. And if I had a longer lecture, I'd love to talk about mobile apps on iPhones, patient record systems, learning accelerators, infusion pumps, anything really. Everything I have looked at has got this sort of problem. But if you don't believe me, you can play with this afterwards. But I'm going to just take you through a simple calculation that could have been what lay behind Kimberly Hart's problem. Here we go. I'm going to make use of the delete key. This has got a delete key on it just there. And I'm going to enter a drug dose of 1.75 and do some sort of sum with it. And I'm going to switch the calculator on. There you go, it's come on. Obviously this is a simulation of the calculator, but I've done it and very carefully copied what the calculator does up onto the screen. We've been doing eye tracking experiments. We know where you look when you use a calculator. You don't look at the display, you look at the keypad. You look at the keypad, obviously, because you need to know which button to press. So to simulate that, I'm going to cover up the display with a sort of funny post-it note. And I'm going to ask you to look at what I'm pressing over there. So I'm going to enter 1.75 as part of a calculation. So here we go, 1 point, and oops, I pressed point twice. So I'm going to hit the delete key. which of course means it's 1 point, and I press 7 and 5, and then I would carry on with the calculation. And if I just peel off this, right, I don't know, words fail me. The delete key is fucked, basically. I think that's a polite way of putting it. It is completely misleading. Right? The calculator is sold as one that will correct errors, and it fucks you if you do correct an error. It makes it worse because it is implemented incorrectly. The number you've entered is out by a factor of 43, which is bad news. I brought along, this happens to be a Casio calculator, and this is a printing calculator. You see it sort of, here you go. It'll print a little record of what I do. So if I enter 1 point, delete 7, 5 plus something, and I'll just tear it off here. I've now got a record of what I typed, and I've sort of simulated this on the next slide. I entered 1.75, and this piece of paper says 75. This is a way of representing what happens in a hospital. I could have shown you an infusion pump. Infusion pumps take logs of what nurses do. So here's a nurse, and you're the policeman, and you go up to the nurse and said, you killed a patient. You gave this patient 75 mils per hour of morphine, say, which is not a good idea. And the nurse would say something like, I thought I entered 1.75, I just don't understand it. I guess I must have made a mistake. And the policeman says, you did make a mistake. You gave them 75 mils per hour. Right? This is a mess, and it is fixable. So let's step back, and I'm going to introduce you to Homer. The reason this is a wonderful picture, Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, he's actually a psychologist, and he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And Homer illustrates this so perfectly, I couldn't resist using this picture. Because thinking fast is all about your perceptual system, which is a big eye on this picture of Homer. We think effortlessly, fluidlessly, reflexively about what we can see and hear. Whereas the inside of your head, Spock as it were, is slow, effortful, hard work. And Homer illustrates this really well. He sees something like a donut and he says, I want a donut. Whatever the inside of his head is saying, it might make you fat or something. Daniel Kahneman gives them slightly more boring names. He calls them System 1 and System 2. So System 1 is this automatic, reflexive type of thinking, and System 2 is this slow, deliberate, conscious thinking. And one of the important points is your slow, deliberate, conscious thinking is completely insulated from the world, but for what System 1 tells it. So System 1 is misled, System 2 doesn't even know. And outside, of course, you've got the world. So here we go. We can call them Homer and Spock. And in fact, I couldn't resist this. It looks just so like a donut, doesn't it? And as you look at the donut, your Homer is saying donut. And Spock gradually disappears. And this is the first time I've had an excuse to buy some donuts. Right? Do you see what happens? Oh, it smells nice, actually. So if you ask some nice questions afterwards, you can have a donut. But what happens is my Spock would be saying, I don't need a donut, I'm fat enough already. But Homer says, I just looked at the picture, and then I had to say, I need a visual aid for this talk. Homer says, they're so nice. This is why I call it the Homer reflex. Because Homer looks at an iPad and says, oh, it's wonderful. And Spock says, well, yeah, it is wonderful. And it's easier to agree with Homer than to think hard about it, because assessing whether an iPad is safe or not is as hard as assessing whether a donut is good for you. You just don't want to think about it, you just want to have one. So, rule 1, we should assess technology properly to break this Homer reflex. Computers don't automatically make the NHS better, in exactly the same way as a donut doesn't automatically make you better, even though you're desperate to have one. So you should assess technology properly. We should also design technology properly, because we can design it differently. I'd love to give you some examples of this. One example would be to get the delete key to work properly. But here's a way of illustrating it. We've got Homer and Spock, and outside we've got healthcare. And I've drawn on a sort of fuzzy line that Daniel Kahneman didn't talk about. And the point is, technology can interface healthcare to Homer. I gave you examples where Casio calculators and Hewlett-Packard calculators ignore errors. Right? So Homer has no idea they're happening. So Spock has no idea the errors are happening. But if we fix the calculators so that if you say press too many digits, the calculator goes beep, 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 beep. Homer would say, well, I don't know, something's happening. And Spock would start thinking. But if the calculator throws away these errors, making no noise whatsoever, Homer doesn't notice anything's going wrong, and Spock carries on oblivious. Spock has no idea the errors are happening. If the devices detected the errors, Homer would wake up, tell Spock, and Spock would think, what can we do about this problem? For instance, start the calculation again, or whatever it is. So here's a little animation. The technology can be designed to get through Homer to talk to Spock. I've got two illustrations of this. This is the simplest one, which is perhaps the best. This is a carbon monoxide detector. And what is it for? Well, if there's carbon monoxide in this room, Spock will go to sleep and Homer won't notice. So what does this do? It wakes up Homer, and Homer says, oh, noise, noise. And Spock says, we've got to get out because there's carbon monoxide. So that is the, if you like, the theory behind this. It's completely obvious once it's spelt out, but IT isn't designed like this. When I was in Massachusetts, I took this photograph of a school bus. Why would I do that? Well, because last year, a wheel fell off a lorry in Wales. You're supposed to keep the nuts on the wheels tight so the wheels don't fall off. And I brought along a wheel nut. Here's a wheel nut. And imagine your job is to keep that nut tight, and it's, as it were, on a wheel stud, right? And it's now loose. If you're in America, you have to remember to tighten the nuts. So Spock has to be trained to, every so often, open a thing, get a wheel spanner out, go round the thing and check all the nuts and tighten them up. Is that going to happen? Spock's under pressure. He gets tunnel vision, he's got to deliver kids to school and so on. And the nuts look okay, and Homer says, world's fine, don't worry. So what we do in Britain is we put what are called wheel nut indicators on them. And it's a bit hard to get them on. Here we go. So here's the nut with the wheel nut indicator on it. They're tight, and it's now loose. So here's a photograph I took in Britain. This very cheap piece of technology, all it does is turn an invisible error into a visible error. Homer can see that and says, oh, they're not straight. And Spock says, well, I better get the wheel brace then to tighten it up. Here's a slightly more sophisticated story. Here's my wife stealing some of my money. And in the old days, you'd put your cash card into the machine, your credit card into the machine, you'd type your PIN number, you'd get your money, and you'd walk away. And you just made what's called a post-completion error. You've left your cash card behind. Rather than retrain everybody about this problem, rather than retrain Spock, which is hard work, we reorganized the design of the device so that you now put your cash card in, you put your PIN number in, and it then pushes the card out and goes beep, beep, beep. And Homer says, well, I better take it because I'm not going to get my money. We have redesigned the technology to avoid a certain sort of problem. If you design technology properly, you can eliminate problems. If any way of improving the NHS relies on retraining the NHS, it's not going to happen. The NHS is Britain's largest employer. If we improve the technology, we can make everything safer. Nobody had to retrain me about how to use cash machines. They just changed the cash machine, and Homer sort of slotted in, and I have not lost my money or my card. Maybe I'm a bit arrogant, but I'll give this a name. I'll call it the Thimbleby Principle. If we design technology properly, we can make the world better. It's sort of the opposite of what I've been saying about infusion pumps and calculators. If you design technology badly, you make stuff worse. The Institute of Self-Medication Practice has a list of things we ought to be doing. It's got a list of error-prone abbreviations, and it's got a list of stuff, and it says these should never be used when communicating medical information, and they are the whole time. And I decided to do an experiment. What would happen if we obeyed the Institute of Self-Medication Practice's recommendation? And I started to write a paper, and I was so surprised at the results, and to save you the trouble of reading it, we could halve the death rate from infusions if they were designed to obey the Institute of Self-Medication Practice's recommendations. I was so surprised, I got a friend of mine, Paul Cairns, to duplicate my work. I described to him over the phone, this is the experiments I did, and he said, got it, I shall do it. Don't tell me anymore, I want to reproduce it independently. So, in fact, we ended up doing 3 completely independent experiments, and they all agreed. And we got excited, we wrote a paper, and if you're into writing papers, you get excited when the Royal Society publishes them. This is a good paper. We called it Solving a Widespread Serious Problem. And recently, I realized it doesn't do that. It doesn't solve the problem. It just points out the problem and says, here is a solution. The paper's been out for a couple of years, and when I went round the Massachusetts General Hospital, there were 50 pumps I played with, and none of them had taken advantage of this paper. Somehow, we have to design to exploit what I've called the Thimblebee Principle. Right? And if we did, we would be saving lives. How are we going to do that? Well, I've told you about the problem with the Homer reflex. You see something like a donut and you want it. Somehow, we have to engage Spock. How do we get Spock engaged in buying IT systems, gadgets, infusion pumps into hospitals so we buy safer ones? Because at the moment, Homer is running the NHS. I said I'd start with cars and finish with cars. So here's a photograph of my Land Rover. And this shows I'm a bit nerdy, but this is a Continental AT tyre. And it looks like a nice one. And here is a photograph of a worn-out tyre with a cut in it, and this looks like, I think you'd agree, a bad one, right? Homer can tell the difference, yeah? But when you go down to Quick Fit, as I did, they all look like the tyre on the left. Even Quick Fit won't sell me stuff that looks this bad. They all look very good. And when I went to Quick Fit, I got these 3 tyres presented to me. They all fit my Land Rover, and which one did I want? So how do you choose which tyre to get? It's a really complicated problem. And basically, Spock says, I don't know what to do. And it's called attribute substitution. Homer takes over and starts making the decision for you. Oh, I don't know, what makes are they? That's just to remind you. Right? So what makes are they? Well, I've discovered Bridgestone is actually a Japanese manufacturer who gives themselves a sort of American-sounding name to make them sound American. Pirelli, I think, are Italian, and Continental, I think, are Continental. In fact, they're German. Homer, Spock, don't know what to do, because I don't know enough about tyres. And then Quick Fit says, what about the prices? And we started talking about the Bridgestone, because that's cheapest. You know, Homer can spot this sort of thing. And because I've got a Land Rover 4-wheel drive and so on, I wanted to change all the 5 tyres. And Quick Fit said, well, if you're going to have 5 tyres, we'll do you a deal. And Homer said, yes, I like deals. I haven't bought this tyre on any sensible grounds. For instance, if it's more expensive for fuel economy, I'm going to lose the small saving I've made. The European Union recognised this was a problem, and it started a scheme to label tyres so that Homer could see how good they were. You may be familiar with these things. This is one I took off a washing machine. You've got the same problem with washing machines. You don't know which ones are better. So you buy Bosch or Philips or whatever it is because you like the brand name. if you want to have an energy-saving washing machine, you have no idea what to do until the EU said they have to have these energy-saving labels on them. And do you know what? The manufacturers responded, and they're now more energy efficient than they were before, because consumers, when they buy a washing machine or a fridge, they can see these labels and they choose better washing machines. That puts economic pressure on the manufacturers to make better washing machines. In fact, fridges have gone not G, D, F, G to A. They go to A star, A star star, A star star, because the rating system has had to catch up with manufacturers improving. That idea has been put onto tyres, and these are the correct labels for those tyres. And what you can see here is Homer got excited by the price, and in fact, on all three criteria the EU are worried about, I've chosen the worst tyre, because I couldn't see it. Because Homer couldn't see it, Spock couldn't think about it, and Spock sort of said, oh, it's too complicated, I'll leave it up to I love donuts. That's what happened. So the EU has put these labels on it, and almost certainly energy efficiency, stopping distance, and noise are going to improve. One of the interesting things is I started this lecture with a crash between two cars, and the EU know that if you have better tyres, you might avoid the crash altogether. Right? Stopping distance is really important, and yet you can't see stopping distance, so you can't think about it. So if we go back to something like this is one of the funny pumps I showed you earlier. 25 people die a year in Britain from electric shock. In fact, 2 of those die at work, and the other 23 die at home, probably from being stupid with electrical things like using a hairdryer in the bath or something. 2 people die at work every year from electrical faults. And there is therefore a law that requires your employer to check electrical devices to be electrically safe. And here's a photograph of a typical PAT tester, as they're called, and you plug in the device. Just so that I don't confuse you, medical devices have higher standards than the usual things in most places of work, but that's a technicality. You're required to test the devices, and if you're lucky, all the green lights come on, and you slap a badge on it saying it's passed the test. Who knows how many people die from bad medical devices? Maybe 25,000 a year. But no, I'm just guessing. It's certainly much higher than 25 people a year, and there is no requirement to have a gadget that looks anything like that. And I've sort of schematically stolen the Q-Tech PAT tester. I put a USB socket on it, and you'd plug it into the back side of the infusion pump, and green light would come on, this is okay, and it would probably print a little label for you. Right? So that Homer can start thinking about how safe it is. If these labels aren't on the devices, we're going to be fooled by what they look like, by how safe they actually are. And you could test all sorts of devices while you're at it. So here's a selection of infusion pumps. And what I would do is not only have these labels on them, but I would weld them on so that they're still there when you're in hospital in intensive care or wherever it is, and you say, why am I being given an infusion from a G-rated pump? I want an A-rated pump. This has got to be visible so that everybody can think about safety. At the moment, you look at these devices and you have no idea how good they are. Just like with electrical devices, when you test them for safety, sometimes you discover things that are unsafe, like the wire's frayed or something, and you stick a label on it that says, do not use. And here are some of the devices that I would stick failed on. So that's almost a good point to stop. We've got some conclusions. I gave you 4 rules. We should rigorously assess technology to avoid this Homer reflex. Don't think, I want it. You should be thinking, how safe is it? Secondly, almost the opposite of that, manufacturers could design devices to avoid you reacting like Homer, to detect and block errors so that you can respond to them. Exploit, I've called it the Thimblebee Principle. If you can think of a better name, that would be great, but this is a good way of doing it. Automate this resilience. If you make devices better, the whole team becomes better, and the computers become part of the team that is delivering healthcare to you, and it all becomes safer. Lastly, to make things better, we have to engage Spock. And the simplest way to do that is to make safety visible with EU labels. So, I've nearly finished. Maybe I should have a EU label for my talk. And of course, I sit in people's lectures and I think, gosh, that's a terrible lecture. Why do people give such bad lectures? Because nobody gives them feedback. They never learn they're giving bad lectures. We have not given manufacturers good feedback about the crap they're producing. They need to hear these things are not good enough and they could get better. We're not telling them, and they don't currently. We're buying stuff because it's just like donuts. So there's an imaginary world. If this was a great lecture and it changes the world, maybe this is what the world would be like. The Seattle Times might have had an article that says the nurse has got full support. Right? Kimberly Hart, a nurse who cared for an infant who received a fatal overdose at Seattle Children's Hospital, is back at work after investigations revealed the calculator she used failed safety tests. I mean, I've really no idea what happened in her incident, but I know that calculators are crap, and I know that calculators kill people. I don't know what happened here, but this is a story that could happen if we started to improve things and started to engage Spock to look more critically at this sexy stuff that is being sold into hospitals. So, I'll have questions and answers, but while we're doing that, I'm going to put up some of my team. I should say the team we've got here has got folk from Swansea and from UCL and from Queen Mary College and from City University, and we're working in a team which is called ChiMed, and if you want to look up more, the link is down there. So thank you very much.